Hello and welcome to the Young Texas Reformed podcast. I'm your host, Taylor DeSoto. In this episode, we're going to look at some comments on this video by Mark Ward, How to Rescue People from the Trap of King James Version Onlyism. Maybe someday we'll do a review of the actual videos that Mark Ward does. I think that's probably a good source of content. But I wanted to take a look at some comments in the comment thread, and then on Wednesday I'm going to try to re-record the video that I didn't release last week with a little more structure. So if you're familiar with my work, you know that I think Mark Ward it really doesn't do a whole lot of good for the church. Honestly, I think that he really doesn't offer a whole lot of sound theological responses to what he calls King James Version Onlyism. And I think that this comment really encapsulates kind of the general sentiment of people who have researched this issue and aren't just critical text onlyists because James White is, or because Mark Ward is, or because Dan Wallace is. But I'm just going to read this comment. We're going to talk about it. So he says, though I disagree with your conclusions, the real issue I have with you is the mischaracterization of the broad group who hold to the KJV. You simply do not present who they are well or accurately, and that doesn't favor your position well. I also think your intentions are misguided, as almost all who use the KJV regularly have come to a solid understanding and familiarity with its English, and thus your argument is not relevant to them. In theory, it's only applicable to a young plowboy who has yet to read the KJV. Why would you tell people who have already learned to understand the KJV English thoroughly, you can't understand the KJV? Can only be used to fan heated flames of the issue, something you claim to not be trying to do. So I don't think you're carefully dealing with the issue, nor are you accurately representing the other side, and your intentions also I strongly question. So when I did the written review of his book, these were actually some of the things that I noticed as well. And this is pretty common with pretty much every critical text advocate that you'll encounter, is they're very quick to mischaracterize what you believe. For example, in the King James Version only controversy, basically everybody that doesn't read a critical text Bible is a KJV onlyist. When you look at Mark Ward's arguments, when you look at James White's arguments, their whole shtick, if you will, is to boil down what you believe into something that you don't actually believe, and then kind of address you as though you do believe it. You see this in Mark Ward's presentation on the TR, where he basically, at the end of it, his big mic drop conclusion is it's basically just King James onlyism, the TR position is. So, first of all, that's not how if your intentions are to find middle ground and to it truly, rescue people from the trap of King James Version onlyism, it's not a good strategy to misrepresent what they believe and then attack that. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And this commenter points it out. You simply do not present who they are well, and Mark Ward does this consistently and repeatedly, and so does pretty much anybody that I've ever had a good not even good dialogue, a dialogue about with about the TR issue. So he goes on and says that doesn't favor your position well, and that's a good point. When you're in a discussion or a debate or a conversation about anything you disagree with someone on, and in order to carry on with the conversation, you actually have to misrepresent what their position is, you're probably not standing on as solid ground as you think you are, or maybe you know that you're not standing on solid ground and you don't care. You're more interested in winning the debate, or you're more interested in being correct about what you believe than actually being correct overall. So he goes on and says, I think your intentions are misguided, as almost all who use the KJV regularly have come to a solid understanding and familiarity with its English, and your argument is not relevant to them. So this was one of the major critiques I had of Mark Ward's Unauthorized book, is that he states his audience are people that read the KJV, but it almost always addresses the person that's never read it. That's the only way that he can get away with saying the stuff that he says, because to a KJV reader, to have someone tell you that you don't understand it, it's like, well, we read the KJV, like we understand it. And then when you say like, okay, well, if there's a word that you don't understand, the task of finding out the meaning of that word apparently is like some impossible mount that you have to crest. And it's like, it's just not, it's not grounded in reality. And anybody that actually reads a KJV will tell you that. And so this is why it's very confusing, because if your audience is someone who reads the KJV and you're trying to rescue them from the trap of King James Version onlyism, according to his words, then why would you say things that are clearly not true, right? And this is one of the points in his book. It's like you think you understand it, but you actually don't. And it's just a very bizarre approach. And so when someone starts questioning the intentions of a man like Mark Ward, that's why. Because you're having this person, this so-called scholar, basically tell you that your experience isn't real. Like someone that reads the King James every single day can understand it, and Mark Ward comes along and says, well, you actually can't understand it, and you don't even know that you can't understand it, right? That's a very peculiar argument that Mark Ward doesn't prove anywhere in his work. I mean, how could you? How could you prove that someone doesn't actually understand something that they like? It's just a very bizarre premise. And thus, a lot of these arguments aren't actually addressing the people he's claiming to address. What his actual audience are people that have not read the KJV, who have no interest in reading the KJV, and now especially don't want to read the KJV. What his work effectively does is prevent people from considering the KJV as a valid Bible translation. That's the audience that Mark Ward addresses in the reality of his work, because the people that he claims to address don't understand his arguments. They don't. They don't get what he's trying to say, because it's not their experience. When you can read the KJV and that this whole platform is like you should stop reading the KJV, it's like, okay, well, why? And the reasons he gives you are just a bunch of reasons that you don't resonate with. So like either Mark Ward is horrifyingly bad at reaching the audience he's claiming to reach, or he's actually targeting a different audience, which I think is probably the case. And so he says, in theory, it's only applicable to a young plowboy who has yet to read the KJV. That's exactly what I just said. It seems as though his audience are people who have not read the KJV and now will never read the KJV because of Mark Ward's work. That seems to be the audience. Now, one thing on the plowboy example, it's really interesting that the plowboy, so-called, could understand the KJV in 1611, but we have this whole generation of publicly educated, young adults and adults who allegedly can't read the KJV. So this is also something that I have a hard time understanding. Like, it's rather insulting to have as your argument. One of the major arguments he sets forth is that the KJV can't be understood. Meanwhile, his whole ministry is propped up on understanding the King James. So effectively, and you see this all throughout his work, where he basically does this thing where he says, I can understand it because I'm a scholar. You can't understand it because you're not. And it's just such a condescending approach. And so it doesn't surprise me that this commentator is questioning the intentions of Mark Ward. So he goes on and says, why would you tell people who've already learned to understand the King James Version English thoroughly that they can't understand the KJV? Right? It's bizarre. And if you just step back for a second of that argument, it's bizarre. And it would only work on somebody that hasn't read the KJV yet, hasn't tried to read the KJV yet, because what Mark Ward does effectively is he'll pick like a very difficult verse based on one word or something like that, and he tries to characterize the whole KJV as if it's just really, really hard language, when every modern Bible has hard words in it. If you were to go and look in the NIV, there's tons of words that you would have to look up and wouldn't know off the top of your head. But we don't characterize the NIV by those occurrences. There's dozens, if not over 100 of them in the NIV. You can look it up. And so it's a very, very peculiar thing. And so when someone is questioning Mark Ward's intentions, there's a lot of good reason for it. And I think one of the more important things that this commenter says is that this can only be used to fan heated flames of the issue, which Mark Ward claims to not be trying to do. But like in in presenting the argument the way that it's presented, that's what happens. So either, and the reason that I'm using Mark Ward as an example, because, you know, people go and they take his arguments, they take his perspectives, and they repeat them online. I see it all the time. In my comment section, I see it on Facebook, I see it all on Puritan board. I mean, it's everywhere. So when I'm addressing Mark Ward, the reason I'm doing it is because he's a great example of the kind of argumentation you're going to see out there. So when someone says, you know, I'm doing this to kind of stir up charity or to create unity or, you know, whatever the thing is, but all the arguments do the opposite of that, like telling people that their experience with reading the KJV is wrong, that the KJV can't be understood, that, you know, all these sort of arguments that don't make sense to someone that's reading the King James. And now people that read the King James now have to deal with this perspective that that isn't true. And that is not how you create unity in the church. You don't misrepresent a whole subset of people in Christ's church and then say that that is somehow creating unity, that that's somehow creating a charitable environment. And so this commenter ends on a pretty good note. I think he says it very well. He says, so I don't think you're carefully dealing with this issue, nor are you accurately representing the other side. And that's true. So we can see that this is a very coherent comment, because everything he says points to his conclusion. There's no like disjointed logic here, right? He disagrees with his conclusions and then says, the real issue I have is that you continue to misrepresent me. And then claim that you're trying to be charitable and you're trying to cause unity and all this sort of thing. He's like, I don't buy it. I question your intentions. So let's see what Mark Ward says. Friend, I'm not sure how much of my work you've seen. So here we go. This whole friend thing, you know, it's not actually answered. Okay, let's continue reading and see if he actually responds to this guy. But you make a good point that I will consider. It is possible to heat the flames on this issue while trying to quench them. See, so is Mark Ward really trying to quench the flames? I don't think so. None of his work points to it, because I have seen all of his work. And nothing points to the conclusion that he's actually trying to quench any sort of flames. He's trying to quench the KJV, and people that read it, no doubt. That's very apparent in his work. I've surveyed a broad spectrum of Mark Ward's work, and I can tell you that based on an honest reading of it, he's not trying to quench any sort of hostility. He's trying to quench people reading the KJV. So I guess if you were to say, like, Mark Ward might be able to say he's trying to quench the flames if the flames are people that read the KJV, but that's not a charitable thing to do from my perspective. So he goes, nonetheless, I must point out that I very, very carefully avoid saying you can't understand the KJV. So this is kind of one of those word games that's being played now, where we're now saying, but I didn't use those exact words, when he has an entire chapter in his book devoted to this very concept. So if we take, you know, Turretin called it syllable catching, right? When you pick apart like little, you know, the way that something is worded or the words that were actually used in order to avoid actually addressing the concept that's being conveyed, you're syllable catching, right? You're not that's not charitable. That's not a healthy take. And he says, that would be a very foolish and untrue thing to say. My argument is much more narrow. I have consistently said that the KJV is largely intelligible, that the vast majority of it is intelligible to anyone who has little chance to gain familiarity with it. But except in his book, he does say that, but then he builds this case around the fact that it's not intelligible. It's one of his points that and so this is kind of the problem with interacting with someone like Mark Ward, is that they'll do like clarifying statements, you know, where they'll say like, well, you know, I'll admit the thing is basically intelligible, and then go on to write an entire chapter on how it's not. So you can see how it might be confusing to someone who is just reading it and say, wait, didn't he say it was intelligible? And now he's saying it's not intelligible. In fact, it's a different language. So like how is the average person supposed to understand that? And so when this kind of thing happens, the only thing I think that is natural for people to start thinking is that, hey, this guy's intentions might not be there. I think that's a fair take. Like, I don't think that's unreasonable at all. So he goes on and says, instead, I am arguing that there are hundreds of words in it that are no longer in use in contemporary English, words of most of which there are easy contemporary equivalents. And he goes on and puts some of his false friends and stuff in there. And he says, I'm also arguing that there are at least 50 false friends. Yeah, there we go. So let me push back a little here, internet friend. It's not right to characterize my viewpoint as saying you can't understand the KJV when I have carefully avoided saying that and don't think it. I won't question your intentions, but I will question your arguments. So, yeah, I mean, this is just kind of a dishonest take from Mark Ward, I think. I wrote an entire series. Maybe we can look at this. Like maybe let's actually find some. Let's find some. Maybe this might be a failure. Maybe I won't be able to find something that. I might not be able to find something here, but we may be able to find something. Yeah, the KJV as a second language. Let's see if we can find something here. I therefore do not think the KJV is sufficiently readable to be relied upon as a person's only or main translation, or as a church's or Christian school's only or main translation. So that's okay. So let's take this quote and let's take this quote and then take a look at what he says. You can't understand the KJV. That would be a very foolish and untrue thing for me to say. My argument is much more narrow. I have consistently said that the KJV is largely intelligible. Instead, I am arguing that there are hundreds of words in it that we no longer use, words for most, blah, blah, blah. So in this comment, he's saying, I'm not saying it's unintelligible. I'm saying there's a lot of words in here that we don't understand, but I therefore do not think the KJV is sufficiently readable. So I'm having trouble kind of reconciling that, aren't you guys? You can say that well, I'm not saying that, but what does it mean that the KJV is not sufficiently readable? Right? So I think that this is probably where the confusion comes to play, right? Because he might not be saying exactly that you can't understand the KJV, but he is saying he doesn't think it's sufficiently readable, right? And that's what I'm talking about. So when you have that sort of I view that as a contradiction, right? A contradiction, or Mark Ward needs to be more clear about what he's saying, where you can't say on one hand, I'm not saying it's unintelligible, and then say, but it's not sufficiently readable. The average person is going to read that and come to the conclusion that this commenter came to. I think that's perfectly reasonable. And, he says, I won't question your intentions. That's kind of a jab, even though you've questioned my intentions, I won't question yours. But it's this guy actually didn't give Mark Ward a reason to question his intentions, because he was very forthright about what he was saying. He's I disagree with you. I have an issue with you. This guy is not speaking out of both sides of his mouth. He's just saying, hey, I have a problem with what you're saying, and I think you've mischaracterized me. So that is being of pure motive. This is not. You know why someone might question the intentions of Mark Ward is because he's saying, I have very carefully avoided saying this, but I have said that. So the average person is going to look at that and say well, maybe there's some there's something going on there, right? And you might not be so unnice to say that his intentions aren't pure, but you might. I think it's very normal for someone to kind of raise an eyebrow, if I had any, to say, there's something that doesn't add up here, right? This doesn't add up. So, when something doesn't add up, where does your brain go? Where does your brain kind of naturally go? Do you go to, you go to intentions, you're like, okay, or you go to maybe he speaks a different language, isn't communicating clearly, right? You kind of go to one of those two directions. Maybe he's communicating unclearly, or maybe his intentions are poor. Those are kind of the two roads you might go. But I think Mark Ward is communicating clearly here. I think he's just communicating out of both sides of his mouth. And so this goes on and says, I see your point, but facts are facts. The KJV is not one and only. It's a good translation, but thus, he's just, this faith guy is responding to him. So let's see if Mark Ward responds again. It doesn't look like the original commenter weighs in anymore. Yeah, okay. So so anyway, let's back up and finish this video. Like, what can we learn from this video? I think that we have to be careful to kind of give the benefit of the doubt to a lot of these arguments and the men who make them. Because to me, this is not how you have a good conversation, and I don't think you're ever going to have a good conversation with someone like Mark Ward and those that think like Mark Ward, because there's not any profit to be had, is what I'm saying. Why is there not profit to be had? Because they speak out of both sides of their mouth, as we've seen. So what we can learn is that it's better just to say truth and not give up ground. And if the other person you're engaging with wants to speak out of both sides of their mouth and play word games and syllable catch, let them do it, but don't interact with that. And I think this is probably what this guy saw. He's like, okay, there's like everything that I thought about Mark Ward was vindicated by Mark Ward's comment. I'm guessing if I was this person, that's what I would have thought. I've said, I'm having trouble with your intentions. And then you read this comment and he's probably like, oh, yeah, well, clearly I was right. So sometimes it's better not to engage and to say the truth, which this gentleman did or woman did, and then move on. And that's really hard, I think, for a lot of us. We want to get into the nitty-gritty of the discussion, and we want to, go back and forth and be right and all that. But sometimes there's no profit in that, especially if someone isn't trying to learn, or if the format of the discussion isn't one where you're trying to find common ground and sort of flesh out an idea. It ends up just being a waste of time most of the time. And that's why I don't, a lot of people have critiqued me for being mean, but the problem is when I see a comment like this, I don't think I actually have to engage with it because they're not being honest with me. And so I'll say harsh things. Now, is that the right approach? I don't know, maybe not, but we don't entertain somebody who is being deceitful. And I think that's what's going on here. And one last thing I'll say, and we'll kind of wrap it up. The reason I think that this is deceitful is because what this gentleman is saying is absolutely true. There's no interaction. There's literally, this is as close to what you might call gaslighting as possible. Your reality is not true. I didn't say that, when clearly he has said that in different words. And so with that, I think we'll wrap up this video, but the moral of the story is that a lot of these arguments made by the critical text are not founded on integrity. They're not founded on actually charitable foundations. They're typically wordsmithed in such a way that confuses people. They're wordsmithed in such a way that makes them say two things at once. They're wordsmithed in such a way that is intended to be hard to understand, I think. Either that or Mark Ward is just a really bad writer, which I think is true beside the point. I think Mark Ward really, really is a poor writer, but the way that the arguments are structured lend themselves to be confusing. And we see this coming out in this comment right here. I've commented on the same thing, and that was why I wanted to make a video on it, because I was reading this book on Authorized, and every page I was reading, and I'm like, man, I feel crazy reading this, because nothing that he's saying is like true to like what I believe about the TR and about the KJV. That none of what he's saying is true about my experience. It was just like the craziest, most surreal thing reading that book and thinking, wow, people that have never read the KJV will believe this. And that's frustrating. This commenter, and when I saw this, I was like, I resonated with this comment big time. And I've had this exact same kind of back and forth with Mark Ward where he does this. And so it's not an isolated incident, and it seems that this is the route that the conversation will always go every time. And, you know, a kind of helpful takeaway is like we need to be able to recognize when someone is not having integrity in their argument or in their discussion, and we just need to check out when we see that happening so we don't waste our time with these kinds of things, because they're not interested in actually learning. They're not interested in actually learning what you believe, because they've made up their mind already. And with that, that's been the Young Texas and Reformed podcast. Thanks for watching. Look forward to another episode coming this week. This was just kind of an impromptu video to get some content out for you guys. Anyway, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and we will see you all in the next video. Thanks.